What is up, YouTube? Matt McKeever here, and in today's video, Adam Martin from my team sits down with Ryan from Carson Law, and they discuss lawsuits. And so this is something we get a lot of questions about. In particular, when should I set up a corporation in order to try and protect myself from lawsuits? And this is a complex question. We're not going to be able to answer all the aspects of it, but we do give you at least a perspective that hopefully will allow you to have a better starting point, I guess, when it comes to talking to your lawyer. Whether you guys decide to reach out to Ryan at Carson Law, there's a link in the video description down below, or whether you're using your own lawyer. It's just important you understand some of these perspectives, because hopefully it'll help you make the best decision for your exact situation. This is very situational. This isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, but I know you guys are going to get value, so smash the like button, hit subscribe, and let's jump into it.
All right, guys, welcome back to Matt McKeever's YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be hosting a video here with Ryan Carson from Carson Law. And of course, you guys already know me. I'm Adam J.D. Martin. I'm the CEO and founder of our wholesaling company. So I've been personally involved with a lot of real estate deals with Matt and in this space and all over Ontario. And so I'm really excited today to be talking in place of Matt here to Ryan about some of the interesting questions we've got about when is the right time to open up a corporation and stop putting things in my personal name. So I think there's a lot of here that we can learn. And I know this is one of the most common questions that I've gotten as well when we're coaching and mentoring new people coming into the space. So Ryan, when is the right time for us to open up a corporation to start protecting ourselves and protecting our assets from liability? What are some of the things we should be thinking about there?
Yeah, and like a typical lawyer, I'll probably answer it with one word here. It really depends on situations. Now, that being said, there are some things that I can give for context and information here that are going to help people kind of come to that decision or conclusion to incorporate or not to incorporate. I mean, the two main reasons to incorporate are going to be, as you said, kind of asset protection, and then on the other side, kind of tax planning, right? Tax and business planning. So there's really those two main benefits that somebody can possibly acquire when looking at the decision of, is it a good idea to incorporate? So, I mean, the main thing to kind of quickly answer the asset protection point, the second you incorporate a company, your personal assets and liabilities are going to be shielded from those of the corporation, and vice versa. Any assets and liabilities that you have in the corporation are going to be shielded from you personally. So there's not this crossing over really, unless some really exceptional circumstances happen. You'd have to get into a situation where you've got officer and director like negligence, more or less, which, using the word in layman's terms, like saying somebody's been acting negligently, is a little bit different than legally proving negligence. Like, it's a much higher threshold on the legal side as opposed to just saying, oh, that's so negligent of them, right? So it really does usually take quite a lot and some extenuating circumstances to actually have corporate and or personal liability cross over in the two different situations.
Okay. And sorry to cut you off there, but what would be some of those circumstances? Like, are we talking, like, obviously you're making it sound pretty serious. So like, are we talking about things like financial fraud or some sort of like what else, what other circumstances would get us to that point where we could legally be considered negligent to where your corporate and personal would blend in liability there?
Yeah, you're going to be looking at some pretty serious things, like, again, proving legal fraud. And again, somebody saying, oh, that seems like fraud to me, and proving that it's fraud are, again, two different things as well, right? So there are some pretty high thresholds to prove officer and director negligence and fraudulent activity that would then kind of mean that your personal assets could be encumbered by potential corporate liability, right? And then vice versa, flipping it around the other way. It's probably very hard to think of a situation where you did something in your personal capacity completely unrelated to the corporation that could bleed over into like the corporate assets, right? So for the most part, people for many, many years and decades have relied on this kind of corporate shield between asset protection and creditor protection on the personal and incorporation component, right? So the second you incorporate a company, as long as you don't do something like we've just alluded to, where this piercing of the corporate veil is what they call it in the legal world, as long as you don't do something like that, which would be an extremely high level of something being kind of fraudulent or negligent, as long as you don't do that in a personal nature as an officer and director of the corporation, that's the key too. You have to be an officer and director of the corp to have the personal component get triggered, right? If you don't do that, then there's very, very few instances when you're going to have that isolation breached, right? That creditor protection and asset protection crossover from company to personal. So, I mean, the second you incorporate, you get that protection right away. So it's less complicated than the second part, which is you might want to incorporate for business and tax planning, estate planning purposes, right?
Yeah.
The best I've ever had it explained to me was by my accountant, who basically said, lots of people kind of this magic number floating out there, like, oh, you know, if you make you know, this 6-figure range, then you should incorporate, which that could be true, right? That could be a good signal for you to be like, hey, I should probably discuss incorporating. And so I don't want to say that that's not true, but what he said to me, and I think it's a great way to look at it is, and a lot of real estate investors that you guys have subscribing and listening, whether they're new or old, and even yourselves personally, I mean, the key principle to kind of ask yourself is money staying in the corp, or do I need to take it all out to live off of and or make the project work, right? So if at the end of the day, you know, I'm going to, you know, go into a fourplex and it's my first deal, and at the end of the day, this is completely secondary income for me. Like, I'm still going to be a lawyer, so I'm still living off my lawyer salary and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just buying this fourplex to basically create a secondary cash flow, which hopefully eventually will lead to like maybe primary cash flow. But if I don't need to take that money out to live or anything like that, and I'm going to keep it all kind of sheltered in a bank account, then definitely you want to incorporate, because you'd rather pay income taxes and other taxes at the corporate rates than your personal rates. The problem is, if the problem people get into is they incorporate, maybe not understanding that entirely, and then they take a whole ton of money out or all of it out, and then you just defeated one of the key purposes of incorporating. You're not going to get any tax benefit because you sucked it out in your personal hands. So you're going to have to pay at the personal tax level still. So if you can leave money, all or a good chunk of it, in the project or in the vehicle, then incorporating will start to make a lot of sense from a tax point of view as well.
So I think there's a big delineation here then from somebody who might be considered a business owner versus somebody who might consider themselves an entrepreneur, right? Somebody who actually has staff, employees, retained earnings, hopefully, and they're not really living off of that, right? And I think it's the typical owner operator, or as some authors have called them, the technician, who's going to be the sole kind of owner operator in that business. They're more than likely living off of those profits, right? Every time a project is completed, they're now drawing that as a salary or drawing that as cash to live off of. So I think that's a really interesting and fair point. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned sort of that veil, right? That legal shield that you have instantly. So I think that's a really interesting thing to consider, as well as the tax advantages. What are some of the costs to incorporating? Like, what's the actual process? How do I get there? Because, you know, there's lots of names, there's lots of sort of ambiguity. Are there different share structures I need to think about? Like, how does this all work?
Yeah, I mean, normally what happens, I mean, anybody can technically incorporate, like it is a public function that you can do through the province, through the ministry. So you don't need a professional to do it, but just like anything, I mean, unless you're really knowledgeable and experienced about it, just like I'm not going to probably go and try to do the changes in my electrical in my house or the plumbing or something and call a professional. You probably want to call a lawyer and accountant familiar with proper business structures and planning to handle your incorporation, right? So we normally recommend, if somebody gets in touch with us or we're working with a real estate investor and it's kind of the decision is, we want to incorporate or create corporate structure, we'll make sure that we've kind of got a tax memo from the accountant first. They call it a tax memo or step memo or whatever. And so I normally say start there, because then we know we've got the tax planning and advice in place, because everybody's doing this, or most people are doing this in part to make some money. And so one way to obviously make money is to be more efficient on how much we're paying in tax and so forth. So we want to make sure they've got that tax structure in play. So we usually get that from the accountant first, or try to recommend our clients to go and do that with their accountant first. And then as lawyers, once we have that in place, we typically have all the information from that letter we need to then start putting all the paperwork in place. There's some signing that occurs, and then there's registration, and voila, you've got a corporation, right? I mean, in Canada, the US has a couple different variations of a corporation. There's really just provincial, or like provincially incorporated companies in Ontario and across each province, or a federally incorporated company, which is a Canada number. Basically, you get a Canadian number.
Yeah. What are some of those differences? Because, I've obviously been involved in a number of transactions now, and I would say very rarely do I come across one of our assignees or somebody that we're interacting with as a seller having that Canada designation, right? More often than not, it's a series of 7 or 8 numbers and then Ontario Inc., right? So what sort of privileges do I gain, or what do I lose by not being federally incorporated or countrywide?
Yeah, there really isn't any like benefit pros and cons per se. There potentially are some higher regulatory components with the federal. They're pickier with, like, if you want to choose a specific name, like if you did Problems or Profits Inc., they actually will require a very specific search to be done. And it takes a couple of days to, verify and say, yeah, there's no issues and all that kind of good stuff. And then you can continue with the process. Whereas the Ontario, you can do the search very quickly. It's not as extensive and I guess not as thorough, because it's not as extensive, but it's a bit easier to get names approved through province to province than potentially federally. But one benefit that I think is kind of there with the federal incorporations is most other countries around the world, give or take a couple, they do all their business incorporations at a federal level. So if you were kind of going to use the company outside of Canadian borders, it's not a bad idea to be federal. It just kind of makes more sense to people. Maybe financing approval and stuff like that would be easier if you were using it in other jurisdictions, right? Other than that, I mean, for the purposes of this conversation, I really don't think there's probably not a lot of pro and con one way or the other. But you're right. Most people just go with an Ontario, because, we'll use Ontario as an example. But sometimes, each province has different restrictions too. Okay. So for example, one of the issues that people run into with Ontario companies is Ontario companies for the longest time, and I think they're working on amending this if it hasn't been amended already with the OBCA, is you have to have a minimum level of Canadian residents as directors, right? Whereas I know I think it's Nova Scotia and BC incorporated companies do not have the same restriction. So if you were dealing with people who had money coming in from, say, the Middle East or over, in Southeast Asia and that kind of thing, and you wanted them to be able to have directorship, but you can't comply with the minimum requirements for an Ontario directorship, you potentially end up getting incorporated in some of these other provinces, right? So
yeah,
those are things to consider.
That could be potentially a big deal for people, particularly in real estate investing, because I also have a mortgage license. So I've done several mortgages, a few $1 million in lending. And that is a criteria that we have to look at, right? Is how's your money seasoned? What's the source of funds? Like, can you show me where that actually came from? And that is an issue for some people, right? They're receiving money internationally and they don't really have a whole lot of documents to support how they got that money or where it's coming from. And that can definitely be a big challenge. So that's actually a really interesting pro that, or potentially con if you're here in Ontario, to bring up. One thing that you kind of inferred there through that discussion then, though, is that somebody from, say, Ontario could get an Ontario corporation set up and then more than likely have no issues doing business in other provinces. Is that correct? So as an Ontario corp, can I go and buy, for example, a rental property in Alberta? Or what we're really seeing right now is a lot of people going from Ontario to New Brunswick. So would I have any issues, do you think, if I tried to hold real estate in that corporation?
I don't think you would. I mean, again, we're only licensed by province. So you'd be best to check with the people in New Brunswick, like the lawyer you'd use to close. You'd probably want to check with them. Any issue using my Ontario corp? If they said no, then I guess that's one box checked off. And then I guess the other one you'd want to check off is just to make sure the lender doesn't have any issues with it in regards to like, oh, it's an Ontario company acquiring a New Brunswick multiplex. Like if those are fine and they're checking off all the boxes, then you likely don't have any issue at all. And then the last one, I guess you just would want to check off is there going to be any issue with property insurance? If all those, boxes check off, in the positive, then you kind of got your answer. You're okay. That being said, I'm not aware of there being any specific restriction for it in Ontario. Have we seen that happen a lot? No, not at all. Like, I think I've only in about 15 years, maybe seen like half a dozen or so, like external provincially incorporated companies actually close and hold title for properties in Ontario. And actually, in most cases, they weren't even the title holder. They had a person or an Ontario company holding the title, but in trust for like some other parent company from, say, BC. So,
okay, no, that all totally makes sense to me. Is there any difference then after? So I'm a real estate investor. I've made the decision to incorporate because I'm going to receive some tax benefits and shield some assets and some liability from the long reach of the law. If I'm negligent in other ways, I guess, or just for general security purposes. Is there any difference now once I've incorporated in the closing process or cost to close or anything like that I should be concerned about after I've incorporated? Like, what's going to be different from the first property I purchased in my personal name to now the first property I'm purchasing as a corporation from your end?
I mean, I guess one thing to consider, and this would be something for people to think about as they're starting out and or I think scaling from like doing their first couple properties to, maybe trying to go from 2 or 3 to like 10 or something like that kind of thing. You might not have already incorporated and now you're trying to figure out, okay, well, it's going to be much better for me to incorporate. So one of the things to think about maybe before you get, on a head start and do those first couple deals, is land transfer tax. Because so one of the issues you'll see happen is, let's say I bought 2 properties. My first deal, is really excited. They were great deals. So I just went at them and I got them and I took title personally. And I've never had a company incorporated as of the date of the acquisition. The issue you're going to end up having is to move those properties from my name personally into a new incorporated company is going to trigger land transfer tax again.
Oh, okay.
So,
that could be a big consequence. This is thousands of dollars.
Exactly. So, and likely more than the first time you bought, because you've probably appreciated the value. Most of the investors that are listening are probably doing like BRRRRs, or they're doing something to the property to probably find a way to have the value quickly appreciate. Yep. So then thus, now it's worth more. And now you have to pay land transfer tax on more of the, on the higher value, right? A second time around, basically from yourself. So you're paying tax on yourself, basically, right? So it kind of goes back to, I guess, that point of, we always kind of recommend to try to, if you have the time, or if you can make the time before you kind of pull the trigger and do your first couple deals, sit down, get the kind of discussion going with a really good tax accountant that's familiar with, real estate investing, or who is a real estate investor, so they can kind of, relate to what you're kind of planning or going through, or what you're thinking of doing. They'll see a bigger picture, right? Like, there's a lot of accountants that are great accountants, but they kind of look at it in isolation and they just say, oh no, you don't need to incorporate right now. Like, you don't have any properties. There's no point. But maybe there is a point related to what we mentioned earlier here, which is, if I say to the accountant that, hey, I don't have any properties right now, but by the end of 2021, I want to have 10. And by the end of 2022, I want to have like 20. And by the time I get to 23, I want to have 40. Well, if you didn't incorporate until you got through the first 10, then how are you going to move those 10 over without there being probably a pretty big additional hit that you really don't want to pay? And then maybe you won't switch them, right? Because it doesn't make sense, right? So it is a good idea. If you're asking the question of when should I incorporate, not only is it good from a tax point of view and the liability that we talked about, but it's kind of future business opportunity as well, which is you don't want to get hammered here with a land transfer tax double up.
Yeah. And you know what? That makes sense. And if anybody's listening and thinking, well, that seems like an unlikely scenario, I'm here to tell you it's not, actually, because I am personally aware of at least one person that has got started in real estate and was planning on buying a couple, maybe a few, and then just happened to buy 120 units in their first year because they were very successful at negotiating. They were also successful at drawing in financial partners. They had a great year. And so I think that proper planning on an approach like that, even if it's not your plan to buy 120, but even if, you're planning to buy one and you end up with 2 or 3, I think that this type of planning is very important. My company right now, we're listening to a book called Discipline Equals Freedom, and Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. And he's really all about this idea that, once you've got a plan, if it changes, as it likely will, you at least have a structure to work within, so that, as the plan's changing, you're making small tweaks instead of large course corrections that you were completely not prepared for. So I think that's really important to consider. On that topic, Ryan, I know things obviously do change as people go along their investing journey. Sometimes what can happen is you set out with partners, right? And so I know that you and Matt have already shot a video. I suggest you guys go watch that video on joint venture partnerships and how to structure those. That's on the channel already. But one thing I wanted to ask now is, what happens when something changes? So, again, I've bought some properties personally. Maybe then I later decide to incorporate, but I bring a partner with me. And let's say we either do or don't buy an asset yet. And what happens when that partnership sort of splits up? So what happens if I get into this with a partner and then somehow in the near future, that partner's not around anymore? Something went wrong.
Yeah. So, I mean, great point. So depending on how you got stuff structured or didn't structure stuff will dictate kind of the answer to that question, right? If you weren't incorporating, then most of the time your legal document to govern here would either be a joint venture agreement, which you alluded to, which is very common amongst real estate investors, or if you were remaining unincorporated, then you'd be potentially in a partnership agreement. Most real estate investors seem to use the joint venture approach because a partnership agreement creates additional obligations to each other, and it's governed by the Partnerships Act and all this kind of stuff. So most people go the route of a JV agreement that allows you to kind of have a lot of the same perks and everything as a partnership agreement does, but you have less regulatory and onuses to one another as partners, because you're not actually partners, you're just co-venturers, right? So a lot of people go with the joint venture, but you could be in a partnership as well. Or if we were incorporated, like let's say you and I are in XYZ Inc. and it owns 5 properties and we're both on as shareholders, then we would normally have a shareholders agreement. And that would be essentially replacing the JV and the partnership agreement. That would be the legal document that kind of governs and outlines, hey, me and Adam aren't getting along anymore, or, whether we hate each other or it's amicable, but one of us needs to exit or wants to exit, what's the exit strategy? So any of these agreements, one of the key pieces in them is the exit strategy or the dispute resolution component. Because the last thing you want to do is have a situation where you don't have any of this in place, or you have it in place, but it's not very well written and it's not a very, there's not a good dispute resolution / exit strategy built into it. And you have to go to court to fight it out anyways. That will kind of defeat the purpose. So those are the agreements that typically you'd hope to see this all noted in, so that it governs everybody accordingly on valuations, buyouts, exits, etc.
Okay. Yeah, and from my perspective, that seems like something, correct me if I'm wrong here, but that seems like something that would be very valuable to do before the conflict arises, right? Before you get any assets, I think is probably the time, right? Is like, hey, before we get into anything, let's understand what our exit strategies are and what's really going to happen while we're all still friends, because hopefully we're entering the partnership on really great terms. And everything should be crystal clear, where it becomes pretty quickly, and from what I've seen with some people, it becomes clear as mud pretty quick, right? When you're in a bad situation and there is conflict and you're not really sure who's owed what or what the responsibilities were of each person. And I think that's the only thing I want to add to this conversation before we wrap up is these types of things. We can have a lot of verbal agreements and we can have a lot of great ideas, but if you're not meeting with those professionals, like Ryan suggested, meet with that accountant and really figure out the tax plan before you get started in purchasing assets and really map out what that, it doesn't need to be a 10-year plan, but if you really understand what is it that your goals are and how are we going to get there, you can often get a much better plan. And that's where I think you get the most value out of somebody like Ryan here and Carson Law, who's going to be able to actually give you the proper advice and the proper path to take, which is going to get you those desired outcomes and ultimately get your goals hit. So thanks again, Ryan, for coming on today. I know I learned a bunch here and there were some things that I hadn't considered. So I appreciate you coming on. And I know Matt McKeever is very happy to have this type of content on the channel because we get asked these questions all the time. And this is a really rare opportunity for people to tune in and actually talk or at least listen in on our conversation with a real estate professional lawyer here. So this is amazing.
The best way to get all our contact information is just visiting www.carsonlaw.ca. And then there you'll obviously have not only general telephone numbers for the office, but my cell numbers there, my email. Email is the best way to reach me. You can reach me at ryan@carsonlaw.ca anytime.
That's fantastic, guys. Make sure you're taking advantage of that stuff. And I know we're going to shoot some more exciting videos with Ryan as well to uncover some more of the questions you guys have about Canadian real estate and some of the laws and legal stuff around that. So tune back in for more with Carson Law. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
What is up, YouTube? Sorry to interrupt, but before you guys wrap up this video, I've got a quick announcement. We put together a survey where I'd love to get your input on your perspective on what other content should we shoot on this YouTube channel. I've literally made thousands of videos, talked for thousands of hours now about YouTube, and I'm just not always sure what to talk about next. Sometimes it feels like I'm just beating a dead horse, but I'd love to hear from you guys. What subjects should we go reapproach? What videos should we remake? What subjects have we just completely ignored that, like, duh, we need to go make a video about that? Let us know, not in the comment section, but through this survey, and there'll be a link in the video description down below. Thanks, guys. I'll see you in the next video.